He was a survivor of the Holocaust. He was Jewish. His parents went through the Holocaust. He went through the Holocaust. And the thing that the question that he wanted to ask was the German people, there were some who resisted the Holocaust and what Germany was doing this. So I don't want to paint a paintbrush to say all Germans did this. But what I do want to say is that when it comes to sadistic behavior, only 2 to 3% of our population actually engages in sadistic behavior like what we saw with the Holocaust. And so there were actually a couple researchers, Philip Zimbardo, Stanley Milgram, and Tajavel, all wanted to know what could make really decent people, good people, support either passively or actively this very horrific thing that was going on in their country. And and there's some different perspective. I'll rehearse these really quick, because you probably heard of these experiments in Psych 101 or somewhere along the way. There's some really good movies out about them that were done recently. But Stanley Milgram wanted to know why so many people would torture someone almost to the point of death. And so his approach is let's put people in a condition that of authority and see what they do. Okay. So Milgram originally, when he did his research, he went to all of these psychiatrists and psychologists at Yale University. So it's a very prestigious university, quote unquote. And he asked, how many people, if we put them in a condition, would electrocute someone up to 450 volts when there's a XXX may cause death sign on it? And at that time, only they predicted less than 2% would actually go up to 450 volts. So what Stanley did is he put people in a condition that was ambiguous. The advertisement was, and this was in the community, he wanted bakers, doctors, construction workers. He wanted everyday people to participate in this research. And what he did was say, hey, we need to know something about learning and human learning, because we know with animals, reward and punishment works for animals, but we don't know much about human beings. And so in his condition, he brought people in. There was always a Confederate. The Confederate is always going to be the student, and the research participant is going to be the teacher. And he had one of those trick coins to make it look like it was a random choice, which was going to be teacher, which was going to be learner, but it was always going to land on that the participant is going to be the teacher. Okay. And they did a simple task. It was a simple learning task. It's an associative task where you read some words and you ask which one is associated with a word that they learned earlier with those associations. So it was kind of like, so let's say early in the task, we paired bear with bar. So that's the association. And then later in the learning task, we say, which of these words is associated with the word bear? And so we say glass, door, bar, um, house. And the correct answer, of course, would be bar. I'm not talking about drinking a bar, okay? So we're not, anyways. Um, and the learner at that time who was set up, it was a recording device, would either give the right or wrong answer. And based on that, the teacher had the shock box in front of him or her. And the shock box started at 15 volts and ended at 450 volts, which had this XXX, could cause heart condition, could cause death and whatnot. But the increments between volts were 15. So you went 15, 30, 45, and so on up to 450 volts. But what Stanley did is he implemented an authority figure into the situation where there was this researcher. Later, they did it outside of Yale because they thought maybe it was Yale University that influenced people's behavior. So they did it with a more ambiguous business at later points. But the point being is that any time that the teacher got stressed about what was going on, there was this Confederate who was the researcher who would just say, please go on. It's part of the research. You must continue. Even though in the beginning of the research, any of the participants who signed the agreement, they could leave at any time. In fact, they were paid up front. So payment for being a part of the participant had nothing to do with actually participating. They were paid right at the beginning of the research. And so here you have a condition where someone is sitting there and they're doing these shocks, which were fake. The only real shock is they gave a sample shock to the teacher, which was like 15 volts, just so that they knew what the learner was receiving, but the learner never received a shock. And what they found is, and this is the interesting thing, in the general condition, where the learner was in a separate room and it was just you and the authority figure, 2/3, 67% of people would go all the way up to 450 volts. Okay. But what Stanley Milgram found is you can make it so 10% up to 90% will go up to 450 volts. When there's a person in the room who rebels and says, I won't continue, only 10% go up to 450 volts. If there's someone else in the room that goes up to 450 volts, 90% of people would go up to 450 volts. What Milgram was doing is he was quantifying what it takes to make someone who is a good, hardworking, honest person do something that was what we would call evil, what we would have seen in Nazi Germany during that period. Okay. And then later research after that showed that we all have this propensity. His research was partially replicated ethically, I believe in 2015, I think was the latest, maybe 2019. But anyways, that 2/3 number has not changed. That 10% to 90% number has not changed from 1960 to 2000. I think it is either 2015, 2019. Because I get a lot of students, while that would be different now because we're more evolved and all that kind of stuff. No, we haven't evolved at all. We will still submit to an authority figure and blindly follow them, even if it means the death of another human being, which is scary, I know. But the reason I'm telling the story is that 1/3 didn't. And we need to learn the lesson from that 1/3, because that 1/3 had a strong conviction about what was going to happen to that other person. And some of them had personal experience with electricity. And so the lesson we should learn from the Milgram study is not that 2/3 of people went and shocked someone to the point of death. The point of the story is we can resist that authority. But anyways, going beyond that. So Milgram first showed that people will blindly follow a given authority figure, even though they don't have a personal relationship with that individual. Okay. And that kind of went and showed, you know, that's why many people in Germany didn't rebel against what was happening atrociously in their environment. Now we're going to fast forward to 1970s and 1980s to Tajafel, who said, why is it that we would blindly follow someone? Why is it that so many people would do an unthinkable act against another people? And this is where he came up with the idea of a social identity theory. And so last Wednesday, I focused and I told you guys you have to have a good, strong social identity because you'll live longer, you'll live happier, you'll be less likely to get disease. As this slide suggests, you'll be less likely to try and commit suicide, get into addiction, have homeless issue, inner city gangs, family dysfunction. And I emphasize those positive aspects of identity, but we also need to understand the dark side. And so I'm going to go into the presentation for today and show what did Tajafel's research originally show and why did he develop this idea of a social identity, okay? The downside of identity, the downside of cultural identity, the downside of gender identity, the downside of all the identities we take on that we talked about last Wednesday is this. Social identity was originally developed to understand why mass numbers of people could engage in horrific acts towards others. And it's based upon what is called social comparison theory and self-esteem. That when we have a social identity, we meld that into our self-esteem. So when someone assaults our identity, such as a Native American, male, female, LGBTQ, mother, father. I think this one is probably going to hit home most for those who are a father or a mother. That's a hit to our personal self-identity. That's a hit to our self-esteem. And so we go through a social comparison process where we want to feel good about who we are, so we degrade people who are not us. Okay. So in this third point, it's we like to think well of ourselves and by extension, our group, female, male, Native American, American, German, British, African, Russian. Okay. We want to feel good about who we are because that's we made that as a definition of ourselves. So we compare self to others who are different, and by extension, what we call our outgroups. In this comparison, we want to think well of who we are. So we negatively evaluate other groups so that we feel good about who we are. And this is what we call downward comparison. But it does get more complicated than that. When a group is viewed better than our own, and this is where we can get into the prejudice here in the United States and things that happened here in the United States, we can think of Canada. I'm going to depersonalize it a little bit because whenever I talk about the United States and skin color, most everyone gets uncomfortable. And so I'm going to bring up Canada instead and about upward and downward comparison. Here in the United States, we judge based on skin color. The darker the skin is, the more prejudiced we are towards those individuals. In Canada, their prejudice is based on language. So in Canada, if you speak English, it's like being a traditional white person here in the United States. If you talk French, it's about the traditional Black person here in the United States. And so the French-speaking people in Canada are negatively evaluated. But those French speaking people also do upward comparison and want to be like those English speaking individuals. And I think it was Klein who brought this up. And I apologize if I'm getting the wrong student in the class. One of you mentioned in the class recently that a lot of Native American youth are trying to um, ignore their Native American roots and be more quote unquote white American. All right. And so they're ignoring that to be more of the colonist kind of persona. And we mentioned the troubles that this group is going through. We have high suicide rates, we have high addiction rates, we have high homeless rates among our youth right now in the Native American communities. Because what happens is they get outside of their traditional identity. They lose connection with the people that they are connected with, their language, who they are as individuals, and they discriminate against their own individuals, trying to be a group that they don't belong to. Um, and I don't mean to say that in a negative way. What I'm trying to say is that when we lose a sense of who we are and the people we came from, we saw in the previous slides, this one right here, we saw in the previous slides that all of these negative things can happen when we lose a sense of who we are and we deny who we are. In a sense, we should be proud of our culture. Okay. But my point being is that the source of prejudice, if we look at it from a social, psychological perspective, from a social identity perspective, is when we start to either upwardly compare or downwardly compare, this leads to prejudice and discrimination. All right. The reason that white people feel good about themselves is because they compare themselves to other groups and degrade those other groups so that they feel better about themselves. I'll go back to the Canada example because um, you know, just to disassociate this problem a little bit. So an speaking person in Canada will degrade a French speaking person in Canada in order to make them feel better about their own behaviors and their own way of living. If you want to think about it from a colonial term, here you have these individuals who are coming into a country and they're being awful human beings. They're killing mass number of people. They're taking land. They're stripping forests. So the natural thing to do would to do this social comparison and say, well, you probably all heard these stories. We are the civilized people and they are the savages. Because that made them feel better for not to be rude, the genocide that they were creating. Okay. And so the negative side of social identity, and I want to make this clear because we will be talking about this throughout this course when we're talking about culture, is that when you have a strong cultural identity, you have the ability to live longer, live with less disease, be more healthy, stave off things like addictions and mental illnesses and all those things. But the downside of it is then you do have the propensity to be more prejudiced and discriminatory against other people. And and um, and so this is a fine balance. But the reason why I started with the Milgram study is that 1/3 of people that refuse to identify with that research, that refuse to say, I'm not going to do this, is the lesson we should learn from, the lesson that we should follow. especially when we're proud of where we come from. There was one person in the Milgram study. He was an electrician, so he stopped at like I think like less than 100 volts. I think it was 90 volts, and he's like, "I'm not going to do this anymore," because he realized the experience that he went through is the same experience as that person sitting in the other room. And he's like, I'm not going to continue with this. And uh the researcher who was supposed to be the authority figure said, you must continue. This is part of the research. They signed up, they can quit at any time, but obviously they're not quitting. So should continue with what you're doing, teacher. And this guy said, no, I've heard the pain he's going through, and I'm not going to continue. I'm going to stop where I'm at. And 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 that's what we find with the stories of that 1/3 of people who didn't go out all the way up to 450 volts, is that they came to the realization that if I was in that person's chair, I'd want the teacher to stop too. And that's the kind of antithesis, the counter thing about identity, is we have to realize that regardless of our identity, Native American, male, female, mother, father, that that person who is sitting opposite to us, that is not like us, experiences the same feelings and emotions and thoughts that we do. And anyways, my point is that we don't have to use our identity in a negative way. But between Taja Fells, Zimbardo's with prison studies, which we'll get into later in the course, Stanley Milgram's research, and we can go back further than that, is that how we identify with our world can set us up for positive behaviors, healthy behaviors, but the negative side of this, it can also set us up for us to do atrocious things to other human beings. Okay. So at this point, what I want to do is transition to current research on identity and culture identity and all those kinds of things to emphasize what is being done currently on research with social identity. And we'll bring up some verse 2023. And this goes back to the question that was asked a week or so ago. What happens when we have competing identities? And in 2023, you and et al. Found that individuals who come into a situation when the social identities conflict, being in our example, Native American versus mainstream American culture. Probably the most common one is being an Asian American, trying to take those traditions, but also trying to be an American. What happens when those two things conflict with each other? Um, and what you and et al. Found is that when your two identities clash with each other, we have more difficulty planning for the future. We're unable to be able to see beyond just this moment. What we get is when there's conflicting identities, we get stuck in the here and now. We get stuck in the past, and we're unable to move forward into the next phase of our life, the next area of our life that we belong in, and we get stuck right here and right now. Okay, so that's one research that was done. Other research that was done in 2023 is that we found that suicide, and I mentioned this on Wednesday, is a combination of depression and loneliness. And I think on Wednesday I mentioned the hospital example, but I'll review it right now. There was some researchers who went to hospitals where people were admitted because they just couldn't resolve their depression issues. They had no suicidal thoughts. They just couldn't handle their depression symptoms. And then other people who went into the hospital who had depression, who were there for suicidal reasons. They tried to commit, or they just got to that point and they said, "I'm done with this world," and someone caught them. The interesting thing is those people who were there that just, and we gave them two measures, one measure of depression and one measure of loneliness. I should say this in the beginning. The depressive group that just went to the hospital because they couldn't handle their depression scored high in depression and low in loneliness. However, the individuals that were there for suicidal ideation scored both high in depression and high in loneliness, meaning it's the combination of those two things that can create this condition where a person will enter into these behaviors. Zhang et al. In 2023, there's something called exlemia. Exlemia is the inability to understand your own emotions and the emotions in other people, meaning that we don't have an understanding of why someone is crying, why someone is happy, but we also don't have an understanding why we're crying or we're happy. And what we found is that the association in adolescence, this is specific to adolescence, is exlemia plus loneliness results in self-injury behaviors, non-suicidal. So people who, adolescents, I should say, who self-harm, they cut themselves, they hurt themselves, they do things purposely to injure their self, but they're not suicidal, but it creates that behavior that we've seen. Burke et al. In 2023 found that increasing social connection and decreasing loneliness in middle school reduces dropout rates in high school. So in this situation, what they did is they randomly assigned some middle school to the traditional middle school and other middle schools where you emphasized social connection, you emphasized friendship, you emphasized your identity with that middle school. And what they found in 2023 is the traditional middle school had the same dropout rates that you would expect. But in the schools that emphasize social connection, connection with the middle school, connection with other children, connection with other individuals, the dropout rates were significantly less than the traditional middle school. Zah and Aslam et al. 2023 found that older adults who maintain career social connections after retirement live longer and healthier lives. So we've known for decades that the group that is at highest risk for suicidal behavior are males between the age of 50 and 65. And we've known that the reason behind that is because that's when those individuals start to disconnect from their social identities as workers, as career people, and all those things. But Zoe and Aslam reinforced this idea because what they found is individuals who just retire and they leave their past behind, they leave their career, they leave everything behind and just become retirees, tended to die at a younger age than those older adults who did not leave their career identity behind. They kept it with them. They were proud of it. They talked about it. They may not work there anymore, but they maintained this identity of a teacher or a construction worker or a social worker or a counselor, and they were proud of that. Those individuals tended to live longer and healthier than those who tried to leave their past behind. Jordan in 2023 found that social connection as a self-care strategy for depression and anxiety and trauma symptoms was better than the traditional self-care strategies such as medication and therapy, meditation, taking a mental health day. We found, and I think this is probably one of the important parts about finding a strong social connection, especially a cultural connection, is we found that those individuals who spent time emphasizing who they are, where they came from, and the people they are connected to decrease depression and anxiety and trauma symptoms better than therapy, uh, meditation, all of those things that we think of when it comes to when we think about self-care strategies. This tends to be the number one thing that we can get into that will actually reduce all of these symptoms besides all of those things that we think traditionally would help with depression, anxiety, and trauma. And this one I just added 2024 research in New Zealand found that social isolation influence brain aging. The more social isolation, the faster the brain ages. And when the brain ages, one thing that I don't think we emphasize enough in physiological classes and biology classes is brain age precedes body age. Okay. And what I mean by that is your the is that frailty, like not being able to walk, getting diabetes, being frail, not being able to hold your bowel movements. All of those things come after when we start losing memory, when we start losing cognition, when we start losing sensory abilities and perception abilities. So when the brain ages, then our body ages behind that. And what research in New Zealand found is that it has to do with social isolation or social loneliness. It has nothing, while it does, it's more predictive than, and I think I mentioned this last Wednesday, social isolation or social loneliness predicts our aging process better than our exercise habits, our eating habits, our smoking habits, because when the brain ages, the body ages after it. And research just recently showed that yes, in fact, indeed, when we are lonely, when we isolate ourselves from other people, our brain age speeds up. It starts to disintegrate, if you want to use that term, much quicker than when we're not isolating ourselves, when we engage with the world. And so I just wanted to bring up that current research that has been done in the field. And for today, we're getting on 12:40.